The Imperium in the galaxy of the 41st millennium is beset by alien horrors on all sides. But not all Xenos are created equal. While, for example, the savage Orks have plagued humanity ever since it first reached into the stars, some alien species have arrived much later on the galactic stage, and in a completely different way too. This study of xenology is the subject of interest for Magos biologists and Ordo Xenos scholars, for it is imperative that the Imperium finds ways to counter these threats as effectively as possible. But in humanity's fight for survival, few of the troublesome Xenos have been as ambiguous as the Tau, for they have proven themselves to be both a serious threat and an insignificant pest in equal measure. Let us then proceed to elaborate on their conflicts with the Imperium of mankind. It is the 35th millennium. Although the eastern fringes of the galaxy have been officially designated as integrated into the Imperium, the reality is more nuanced than the Administratum would like to admit. Apart from the civilized realm of Ultramar under stewardship of the noble Ultramarines, this corner of the galaxy still suffers large swaths of unexplored and uncontrolled space. In this region, there are many isolated worlds who only barely recognize the Emperor's authority, or remain even fully independent. Not to mention the many undiscovered species of Xenos that lurk out here. Ever on the quest for knowledge and lost artifacts of technology, in 789 M35, an Adeptus Mechanicus Explorator fleet was ordered to map out this backwards and dark region of space for the Imperium. Their efforts were hindered by a large and difficult-to-traverse nebula that stretched out across several star systems, forming a natural barrier. But the voyage finally proved fruitful when one of its ships, called the Land's Vision, successfully managed to navigate through the perilous nebula and safely reached the other side. Here they stumbled across the world of Tau. Although primarily dry and arid, the planet supported a variety of different biomes and was hospitable to life. The explorers registered this promising world in the Imperial archives as being suitable for potential colonization, but before becoming inhabited by humans, the planet was already home to various different creatures, most striking of which was the blue bipedal alien lifeform called the Tau. This native species had risen to the top of the local food chain, but was still by all accounts underdeveloped and weak. Their development was essentially at the equivalent of a Stone Age, having just discovered fire and simple weapons. These primitives would no doubt be easily eliminated when the Imperium's colonization fleets arrived. A seeding fleet was dispatched on a mission to colonize the planet, but due to a severe warp storm, would never reach their destination. An unimaginable fury overwhelmed the ships. The entire fleet and its crew were lost to the Immaterium. New colonization efforts would eventually have been set in motion, if not for the grave events during the Age of Apostasy that was about to engulf the Imperium. The power-hungry Goj Van Daya rose to power as leader of both the Administratum and the Ecclesiarchy. His severely tyrannical rule sparked a civil war upon mankind. During this period called the Reign of Blood, humanity was almost brought to its knees. It took hundreds of years for things to return to normal. In the aftermath of these events, parts of the Imperium were drastically reformed. Not least of these changes were the introduction of the Sisters of Battle and Ordo Hereticus. But by then, the world of Tau and its plans for colonization had been long forgotten. The next time the Imperium and the Tau would meet, their initially primitive culture had drastically evolved into a high-tech interstellar civilization. From a galactic viewpoint, their rise to power had happened in the blink of an eye. The start of their meteoric ascension began when they were visited by a Xenos species called the Ethereals. The Tau had historically been split into castes representing the four elements of fire, earth, air, and water. These rival castes fought a destructive war amongst themselves. That is until inspired by the Ethereals' words of wisdom to agree to a ceasefire. Afterwards, the Tau have ever since been united under their leadership, governed by the principles of their so-called Tau Va, also known as the Greater Good. Under their governance, the seed of their promising civilization grew and blossomed into a technological apex amongst the surrounding planetary cluster. In M37, the Tau began their own colonization efforts amongst the stars. Their first sphere expansion began when the pilots and voyagers of the aircast launched their spaceships out of orbit, ready to explore the void. They proved successful in their spacefaring efforts, and one by one the Tau would begin to arrive on their closest surrounding planets. They discovered that their homeworld lay center in a dense cluster of viable exoplanets. On 7 hospitable planets, they established what they call sept worlds. These are Tau population hubs, each with their own similar but distinct cultures. These would rapidly grow to become important worlds within their burgeoning empire, where once the primitive Tau looked up into the night skies and wondered at the mystery of distant unexplored stars. Now they could look upon the shimmering lights of their own interstellar empire with great pride. The various alien species they initially encountered proved either docile or underdeveloped. Several of the more intelligent species were even willing to join their cause. Rather than by military domination, the Tau relied on the superbly effective diplomacy of their water caste to recruit allies to their greater good. In stark contrast to the xenophobic Imperium, each new type of alien that was assimilated within the Tau was celebrated and respected for the unique specializations they contributed to the collective. Their fire caste still honored the martial traditions of their tribal past, and whenever conflicts arose, these so-called hunter-warriors proved more than capable of dealing with any conflicts they encountered. But overall, the Tau only sustained a very rudimentary army. They simply had no need for a large military in this seemingly rather pacified galaxy. Instead, they spend most of their focus and resources on developing their technology, which was spearheaded by the mechanically inclined artisans and builders of the Earth caste. This exponential growth and prosperity provided by their ceaseless toil continued for almost 1,000 years. These developments almost tore the Tau apart, as the speed of their technological innovation and unbridled ambitions far outstripped their cultural development. But under the steadfast leadership of the Ethereals and the uniting principles of the greater good, they rode out the wave until the first sphere expansion reached its zenith. Unbeknownst to the Tau themselves, their survival during this critical period in their fragile development had been largely due to mere luck. Militarily, they could have easily been wiped out by any of the major interstellar races, for to them the Blue Xenos would have appeared like nothing more than an insignificant pest, or worse, an easy prey. To their extreme fortune, however, during these times the relatively minor swath of space they had successfully carved out for themselves was surrounded by vast swaths of nebulae and warp rifts, concealing the young empire from any potential invaders, at least for the time being. Although humanity had at this point already been embroiled in a mortal struggle against the Orks, Necrons, Eldar, and forces of chaos for millennia, the Tau had remained blissfully ignorant to the grim threats that preyed upon the galaxy. The first truly hostile Xenos they would learn about was the Orks. A raiding force had managed to cross into Tau space, and had been spotted invading a Kroot-populated world called Krath. By this point, the Tau and Kroot had not yet formed their iconic alliance, and so initially the Tau were observing the war from afar. It soon became apparent that the Kroot would soon be hopelessly overrun. The motives these newly arrived greenskins had for destroying another race were poorly understood, and the conflict appeared to be no more than counterproductive bloodshed. To the observing Tau, it would be vastly more beneficial if the two belligerents could join the greater good instead. And so in an attempt to intervene, they sent envoys towards the Orks with the intent of mediating a ceasefire. Unsurprisingly, their diplomats were slaughtered on sight. And so the naive Tau got their first inkling that the galaxy may not be such a civil place after all, but they insisted that perhaps the Ork could one day be persuaded to see reason. For now, though, the almost equally savage Kroot appeared to be the more reasonable of the two. And so the Tau joined the war on their behalf. With their technologically superior fleet, the Tau quickly destroyed the ramshackle greenskins' ships. However, these forces proved to be merely a vanguard of a larger Ork Wa that was on its way to invade the system. And before long, they arrived in force. The ensuing conflict would later be called the War in the Place of Union. for it marked the time the Tau and Kroot fought side by side. During these times, the Tau firecast truly came into its own. Necessity mandated that it grew vastly in size, and they developed more sophisticated battle doctrines to meet the threat. After a hard-fought war, and utilizing the combined strengths of the Alliance, they eventually managed to defeat the Orks decisively. As a way to express their gratitude for the assistance of defending their worlds, the Kroot formally pledged allegiance to the greater good. The multi-species Tau Empire would however remain exclusively ruled by the ethereal caste, for despite their lofty ideals of equality, the Tau would always claim to be the first amongst equals. The lack of privileges did of course not mean the other races would not be expected to give their lives for the greater good, as they would be fighting alongside each other in many more conflicts. The Orks would be back for more. Once the word spread that a good scrap could be found in this region of space, several more wars presented themselves at the Empire's borders. Perhaps the Tau could have learned a lesson here, but in their hopeless optimism refused to see the writing on the wall. The Second Sphere expansion kicked off with the Earthcast's discovery of the ZFR Horizon Accelerator engine, which granted them the ability for near light-speed travel. Although not nearly of the same magnitude as a proper warp drive, this development suddenly opened the possibility to travel the immense distances between their worlds in decent time. And so further expansion was the next inevitable course of action. The outskirts of the growing empire soon bumped into the Damocles Gulf, an enormous nebula on their border towards their galactic west. Even for the advanced Tau, it proved extremely hard to navigate. The only place to cross it is a yet unexplored narrow strait that would later be called Mogoloth Bay. The only other reliable option is to go completely around it. On its far side is where the Tau first encountered humanity in earnest. This forward sector was practically isolated from the rest of the Imperium, and so quickly fell prey to the schemes of the Watercaste, whose methods of ever-increasing trade and diplomacy supplied the worlds with heretical Tau commodities. The gradual exposure breeded acceptance and opened the door for them to proselytize to the population about the greater good. Far away from the light of terror, these fools figured that the highly advanced Xenos had more to offer than the distant Imperium, and so against their better judgment, many of them freely collaborated with the Tau. One by one, human worlds were slowly assimilated by the greater good, and came under their collective protectorate. Of course, the Tau heard stories about a galaxy-spanning human empire, but they dismissed these as superstitions and exaggerated myths by an ignorant species. After all, it was the Tau whose grand destiny was to unite the entire galaxy under a single banner, and it was simply impossible for them to accept that other species had already beaten them to it. As more and more worlds were persuaded by the sugary words of the Watercaste, resources from this region of space stopped flowing back into the wider Imperium. As anyone knows, one of the core tenets of the Imperial bureaucracy is that one does not simply stop paying their tithes. Few things disturb a member of the Administratum more than when the tax revenue suddenly and inexplicably dries up. And so the Imperium sent a fleet, led by the Inquisition, to investigate the situation near the Damocles Gulf, and discovered, to their dismay, that many worlds had quietly seceded. Tau military presence on these traitor worlds was practically non-existent, however. And so when the Imperial delegation showed up, the turncoats were quick to renounce the greater good. Of course, harsh sanctions would be handed out to the ruling elite that had allowed this farce to happen. Regulations were put in place to guarantee that such misguided betrayal would not occur a second time. Any members of the Xenos found within this region were mercilessly hunted down and annihilated. Any and all trace of Tau influence was to be eradicated. After this cleansing was completed, a modest military force was stationed to enforce further compliance and to deter the Xenos from returning. During the purge, old Imperial archives of the initial Explorator fleet had come to the forefront. The Administratum connected the sequences of events with disbelief. If their records proved correct, within merely 5 millennia, this primitive alien species had gone from simple planet-locked brutes to being capable of interstellar colonization. Their development was unprecedented. The mistake of not exterminating the Tau earlier was quickly acknowledged, for at this point it would likely be more costly to do so. The plan was postponed, however, for even now the Tau were hardly the most significant threat in the wider galaxy. As always, the ever-overburdened Militarum had more pressing matters to attend to. For now, the Imperium would have to be content with merely restoring what was rightfully theirs. If the alien was wise, however, they would surely keep their heads down. But when the Tau heard that they had been kicked off these worlds, they were outraged. Did these humans really think they could thwart the Tau's manifest destiny? Did they think they could get away with indiscriminately killing peaceful watercaste ambassadors? The Ethereals realized that allowing these setbacks to go unpunished would make the greater good lose face. Tau representatives had been brutally murdered. This was naturally unacceptable. In retaliation, the Tau would back up their campaign of diplomatic conversion with actual military force. During the conflicts with the Orks, the Firecaste had grown to considerable strength. New weapon systems, doctrines, and battlesuits had rendered their warriors more powerful than ever before. The Ethereals believed that their technological supremacy would bring them an easy victory. At the zenith of their civilization, they could face any challenge. And so, the foolhardy Xenos returned to the Damocles Gulf in great numbers, ready to show the brute apes of the Imperium the superiority of their ways. For the Tau, this was total war. Any world that refused to cooperate was invaded by military force. As they had expected, the inferior humans could not stand against them. One after the other, the worlds were conquered in the name of the greater good. Soon they had recovered their former gains, and more. As it appeared to the delusional Tau, it seemed that the Imperium of mankind had been decisively defeated, and so they anticipated expansion even beyond. Before long, the Watercaste was back to their old ways, manipulating more human worlds to join their misguided cause. Some worlds bravely resisted the Tau expansion. Distress calls were sent out to ask for reinforcement, but in a galaxy beset by threats from all sides, these conflicts on the periphery of mankind's domain went largely unnoticed. Severely outnumbered and with no help coming anytime soon, the lackluster Imperial garrisons were quickly defeated. While the Tau were gloating over their grand war of conquest, the wider Imperium had barely noticed that they were at war to begin with. Even though the backwaters of the Damocles Gulf had recently been restored by the Inquisition, due to their insignificance they had been forgotten just as swiftly. The distress calls of the lost planets were barely noticed by the Administratum. That was, of course, until inevitably the tithe stopped flowing again. An unacceptable omen of trouble for any pencil-pushing bureaucrat. This time, the Administratum did not have to guess twice as to what had happened. Clearly the Tau had not learned their lesson, and due to their stubborn insistence, had now earned themselves the right of extermination at the Imperium's hands. In response to the Tau aggression, in M742 Ultima Segmentum Command mustered a reprisal force that would deal with the Tau decisively. The backbone of the army would, of course, be made up of Imperial Guard troops, composed of various regiments, most notably among these, but not limited to, with Acadia 92nd Infantry, several regiments of the Brimlock Dragoons, and a company of elite Militarum stormtroopers. The Imperial Navy was spearheaded by the Retribution-class battleship Blade of Woe, and escorted by many warships made up of a variety of cruisers. Although outside the scope of the Militarum's authority, a staggering amount of Space Marine chapters joined up with the army out of their free volition. Astartes from the Black Templars, Iron Hands, Nova Marines, Raven Guards, Scythes of the Emperor, Subjugators, Ultramarines, and White Scars were present. They would see to it that the Emperor's wrath be made manifest against the troublesome Tau in a manner only his angels are capable of. But, as if that wasn't enough, they would also be granted assistance by Legio Thanatris and their corresponding Mechanicus cohorts. Should a Tau world provide especially heavy resistance, the indomitable might of the Titans and their unmatched firepower would surely break these foolish aliens piecemeal. Additionally, they would be able to rely on the support of several local rogue traders and their entourage and provide essentially auxiliary ships to the Imperial Navy. Although these were outside the standard structure, their idiosyncratic vessels and experience operating in the outer fringes of the galaxy should not be underestimated during wartime. Considering the galactic location of the Tau Empire, this combined force was designated as the Damocles Gulf Crusade. By all administratum estimates, they would likely prove successful in exterminating the Tau, with barely half their numbers present. So with such an overwhelming amount of troops at their disposal, the Imperium considered the war against the Xenos already as good as won. As the Crusade moved into the eastern fringes towards the Damocles Gulf, more and more of the committed troops rendezvoused with the army. Their aim was to spearhead straight into Tau-controlled space and force a decisive battle there, bringing the Xenos main military to their knees. In their wake, a minor Imperial subjugation fleet would follow and reinforce Imperial rule on all planets and conquer those who hadn't. Ideally, the Tau would be completely exterminated. The Crusade force had not yet swelled to its full strength, but the commanders felt it necessary to not wait any longer, and they pushed on regardless. The first worlds they encountered were quickly brought back in compliance. As before, all Tau Watercast members were killed. All Xenos technology or trade goods were destroyed. Many worlds were deeply tainted by the Tau's introduction of abominable artificial intelligence, providing all the more incentive to hate them. Although the Imperium had been lenient before, this time anyone complicit in the Tau's expansionist schemes would face severe consequences. Authority figures merely suspected of diplomacy with them were killed outright to set an example. Inquisitors deemed entire communities guilty of colluding with the Xenos and sentenced millions to a lifetime of service in the Imperium's penal legions. Populations that were too brainwashed by the greater good were burned to the ground. When the Crusade reached the Hydas system, they encountered their first significant Tau opposition. Scouts detected 7 enemy warships of approximately Imperial cruiser equivalents patrolling the edge of the system. Eager for first blood, the Crusade fleet attacked immediately. Using their warp drives, the Imperial fleet entered the system by bursting into real space. This caught the Tau flotilla by surprise for 2 reasons. First of all, due to their lack of knowledge of the true scale of the Imperium, they had considered humanity practically defeated already, and did not anticipate any significant resistance. Secondly, their kind was relatively inexperienced with warp travel, and so they had not considered it possible for an entire armada to suddenly materialize into real space right at their very doorstep. The large Crusade fleet seemed to appear out of thin air, but the Tau were, however, determined to meet the invaders head-on. And so, by responding swiftly, the Imperial advance was met by salvos of powerful long-range torpedoes, forcing the invaders to break up their formation. Long-range laser weapons opened up on both sides, probing at the enemy's shields. The Imperial fleet sent out waves of bombers to target the Tau warships, but their formations were countered by the swift maneuvering Tau escorts. Although the momentum of the Imperial Navy was largely halted as the 2 fleets dueled over long distances, the steadfastness of Astartes would not be countered so easily. One Space Marine strike cruiser continued to advance straight into the heart of the Tau formation. Once they moved within striking range, they opened up their broadside cannons with devastating results. To their surprise, the Tau fleet did not respond to this daring outburst of great firepower. As it turned out, it seemed that the Tau did not possess broadside cannons on their ships, and they were left helpless against this relatively short-ranged assault. Seeing the promising potential, a squadron of sword-class frigates followed in the strike cruiser's wake, similarly sailing right into the heart of the Tau flotilla and pouring their broadsides into them at point-blank range. A few ships even steered ramming course, crashing their Aquila-clad prows head-on into the alien ship. The Tau were shocked by the incredibly brutal Imperial tactics and fled in panic. As they retreated, they were recklessly pursued. They had been caught off guard, but rather than face annihilation, the Tau would attempt to live to fight another day. They launched more escorts to form a rearguard screen while they disengaged from battle, but the damage had already been done. Only a handful of Tau ships managed to escape. The broken survivors would surely bring back word of the invasion. The Imperium had scored first blood, and had no plans of slowing down. In fact, the Crusade had barely begun, and many more worlds required liberation. They pursued the remnants of the Tau flotilla towards the Psychel system. It had been under Tau control for a long time, and it was here that they encountered the first major Xenos population. On one of Psychel's agricultural worlds, it was estimated to be inhabited by several millions of the vile Xenos. If it was up to the Imperium, these settlers would be eradicated. The planet was defended by an orbital defense station and a number of system ships, which was now reinforced by the remnants of the retreating Tau fleet encountered by Hydas. Some skirmishing took place before the Crusade force was ready to attack in earnest. The assault would be split into two. The first objective was to engage and destroy the Tau fleet, preferably not allowing them the chance to escape again. Secondly, a ground-based invasion of the planet would see to it that any Tau on the surface were destroyed. Reconnaissance by the skirmishing ships seemed to indicate the Tau were in the process of evacuating their key personnel from the planet. Rather than allow the enemy more time, the Imperial forces attacked immediately. In the face of the advancing Imperial warships, the Tau fleet scattered almost immediately and did not bother defending the planet. This time they made it out with minimal damage, but they had left the inhabitants of the world to their fate. The ground-based assault was led by Captain Ruman of the Iron Hands, whose first target was the orbital station. It was quickly dealt with by boarding parties, whose assault marines dutifully cleansed it with swords and flamers. The vessel was to remain intact and serve as the Imperium's forward base of operations for the ground assault. With the orbital station in Imperial hands, they would continue on towards the planet's surface, whose orbital weapons were already suppressed by the fleet's firepower. Astartes from the Scythes of the Emperor chapter made planetfall and established a landing zone, making way for the vast amount of Brimlock guard troops to safely land on the surface and begin their war of extermination against the alien population. The Tau desperately reached out for diplomacy with the Imperium, but any and all attempts were ignored. By now they realized that no quarter would be given. As the Brimlock regiments advanced, they were slaughtered without remorse. Abandoned and trapped on the planet with no way out, the Tau mustered their mechanized formations in preparation for a fight to the death. Transports filled to the brim with fire warriors rushed towards the front lines, followed by more heavily armored formations composed of grav tanks and battlesuits. Hammerhead and Lehman Russ tanks exchanged blows. Wherever the two sides clashed, the 17th Brimlock Dragoons suffered heavy losses, but managed to push on regardless. Although supplied with armor of their own, the Tau could not sustain the attrition of battle against the numerically superior foe, and so they pivoted strategies and resorted to ambush tactics called the Kai-Yun. This proved very adept at countering the Imperial Guard, and the invasion force was slowed down. The Tau were afraid that their advanced technology would fall into Imperial hands, and so, while the battle raged on, the remaining Earth-caste workers dismantled and demolished their installations. Ironically, they didn't realize that this foolhardy intervention actually suited the Imperium just fine. After all, the humans were not at all interested in the heretical alien science, and would have razed anything constructed by the Tau to the ground regardless. Drawn into ambush after ambush, and unable to deal a decisive blow against the Fire Caste, the Brimlock troops found themselves stretched dangerously thin. The Tau's cowardly but effective ambush doctrine had inflicted a heavy toll on them, while the defenders themselves suffered relatively minor military losses. In order to prevent catastrophe, the invading force was reinforced by the Tempestus 4th Stormtrooper Company, whose veteran presence managed to stabilize the situation. Unimpressed by the lack of progress, however, the Scythes of the Emperor decided to finally get involved on the front lines as well. Space Marine fire support quickly turned the tide of battle, and the remaining resistance was decisively crushed, allowing the Imperial Guard to duly cleanse the planet of Xenos taint at leisure. After the fall of the stronghold, the rest of the Psychel system was quickly claimed for the Emperor of Mankind as well. All Imperial objectives were met. Over the course of months, the Crusade effortlessly continued to defeat the Tau in a series of skirmishes towards the edge of the Damocles Gulf. While they waited for the final logistical preparations required for the voyage across the nebulae, parts of the Crusade fleet were split into smaller expeditionary fleets to wipe out any remaining Tau holdouts on this side of the Gulf. One of these targets was the system of Vis-El. Far out of its local sun's orbit, the ice planet of Vis-El 5 was inhabited by large Tau fishing colonies. Although undefended from orbit, it was likely that some garrison forces would be stationed to protect it. Reconnaissance had indicated that the world did not have any strategic importance to the Imperium. Weighing the costs and difficulty of invading the ice planet, they ultimately decided that it would be subjected to orbital bombardment instead. The heavy lasers and cannonades of the Imperial fleet struck the planet with incredible force strong enough to cause the icy glaciers to melt and collapse, causing a planet-wide ecological meltdown. As if from epic tales from Terran myths, huge tidal waves engulfed the world and a great flood destroyed any and all Tau holdouts on the planet. Many other worlds of negligible importance suffered a similar fate as they were simply bombarded from orbit. With this part of the eastern fringe cleared of any potential threats in the Crusade's rear, they were ready for the next stage of the war. Official records of where exactly the Imperial forces crossed the Damocles Gulf differ between accounts. This is because segments of the force, those split up and those who had yet to join the muster, took various different routes. Some of them even took the long way fully around the nebulae's tip towards the galactic north. What is, however, clear is that the battered and retreating Tau ships had been carefully observed. It had been noted that all of them escaped into a particular section of the Damocles Gulf, logically inferring that this would be a safe route towards the Tau Empire. The Crusade fleet followed. After 5 months of cumbersome travel, all of them managed to rendezvous at the same location. They were about to enter into the heart of the Tau Empire, and the war was about to begin in earnest. Having of course been forewarned of the invasion by the retreating ships, the Tau had time to prepare. From every corner of their empire they mustered their forces. Ships filled to the brim with fire-caste warriors, earth-caste mechanics, air-caste pilots, Kroot, and their various other allies made haste towards the Damocles Gulf. There was little doubt that the invaders could be beaten, especially on home soil. After all, they had successfully defeated the much larger invasion of Orks before. However, they were forced to acknowledge the Imperium had been a stronger foe than first anticipated. This disillusionment was, however, softened by their propaganda, portraying the invasion as nothing more than a desperate final strike by a dying empire. The foolish Tau were eager to believe that humankind was on its last leg by now. The best course of action, then, was to keep the Crusades stuck on the outskirts of their domain. It would take the invasion force ages to finally reach and threaten their sept worlds. The Tau had the advantage of home soil, and through a layered defense would be able to bleed the foe's numbers while suffering minimal losses themselves. As soon as enough Tau forces had gathered, they would deliver the Mont Ka, also known as the Killing Blow. Once this so-called crusade was defeated, the ignorant Tau believed there would be no one left to stand in the way of the greater good, and things would return to normal. Meanwhile, on the Imperial side, a war council was being held. Having successfully crossed the Damocles Gulf, they found themselves with a wide variety of targets laid out before them. As critical as it had been to reclaim the relatively minor worlds in the name of the Emperor, these smaller battles had delayed their advance and allowed the foe time to respond to the invasion. They decided that now would be the time to strike at a critical target to deal a decisive blow. A major portion of the fleet would split off to form a spear tip composed of their elite troops. They would drive straight at the heart of the Tau Empire, while those left behind continued raiding the outskirts and busied themselves with the subjugation. The new-formed spear tip of the Crusade warp-jumped straight into the Dal'yth subsector. This daring move greatly surprised the Tau. Not yet fully aware of the full potential of warp travel, they had counted on being able to delay and decimate the invasion through a defense in depth. Now, basically, the full strength of the Crusade was suddenly at the very doorstep of Prayen. This outermost planet of the Dal'yth sector is one of their important sept worlds. Established all the way back during the first sphere of expansion, Wasting no time, the Imperial forces attacked immediately. Their approach, however, proved too casual. They had estimated the defense station of this planet of similar caliber as the one encountered at Hydas, but when it opened a devastating hail of fire on the approaching ships, this quickly proved a costly mistake. The first volley of its formidable array of heavy railguns crippled the honor of Damocles and left it floating helplessly in the void. The fleet's escorts swiftly moved in to attack the station in an attempt to occupy and possibly disable its powerful guns. From behind the blind spot of the planet, a Tau fleet of 11 starships emerged to enter the fray. With their escorts already engaged, the main battle fleet had little choice but to delay their intended planetfall and engage the incoming vessels. With both sides aiming to establish dominance in the void, a hotly contested naval battle ensued. The Regent Laxenbai, a Dauntless-class light cruiser, was destroyed by a salvo of Tau torpedoes. But apart from this loss, the exchange of void weapons seemed to turn into the Imperium's favor. More and more Imperial ships trickled into the battle, delivering a terrible pounding against their foe and gradually forcing the outnumbered Xenos fleet on the back foot. Despite the heavy losses of escorts at the hand of the defense station, the Imperium clearly seemed to have the upper hand. That was until a Kroot war sphere emerged from the warp directly on their flank. It powered up all its systems and headed straight for the Imperial transports. Although the Tau superstructure was slow and only had limited range, due to its sheer bulk it could not be swiftly taken down. The vulnerable transports had no choice but to scatter before it. Salvation came in the form of Admiral Jalak's flagship, the Blade of Woe, a Retribution-class battleship who had turned about to help the escorts in their battle against the defense station. With full thrusters, it now cut off the Kroot war sphere's path in an attempt to protect the transports. From their close-range exchange, it seemed that the Blade of Woe carried the superior firepower. Unable to maneuver quickly, the lumbering war sphere had no way to get out of harm's way. The Imperial lance salvos ripped the Xenos structure to metallic shreds, leaving nothing but a dead husk. Although the void battle turned into an Imperial victory, it had been a Pyrrhic one. The Tau had managed to inflict a heavy toll on them. 4 capital-class ships and 14 escorts had been destroyed, which forced the Navy to admit the Tau were a more formidable foe than first anticipated. Fortunately, all of the transports had remained intact, and the planned invasion could commence. However, considering the apparent complete destruction of the Tau armada in the system, an even bigger price than Prayen had suddenly presented itself. Aside from 3 defense stations protecting it, the path towards Dal'yth Prime, capital of the sector, was completely open. Some commanders expected another Tau trap and advised turning back, but others saw an opportunity to finally deal their first severe blow to the Tau. Expecting a new Tau fleet to arrive with reinforcements sooner rather than later, now might be their only opportunity for an easy invasion of the prestigious Sept world. The Crusade had not come all this way for nothing. The Tau deserved to be punished. They had learned their lesson during the previous battle, and so approached the planet with more caution. This time, the defense stations were destroyed at leisure by the long-range weapons of the heavily armed ships. Any further orbital defense weapons were easily suppressed or even outright destroyed. Then, when no Tau reinforcements presented themselves, the ground invasion of Dal'yth Prime commenced.